Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Life and Happiness Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible.
Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the Life and Happiness Podcast, run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano, and let's get back into this episode. So, last time, I spent the whole time talking about Martin Luther King. I actually read out one of his speeches, and that's because I think his values have been misunderstood for a long time now, that people just use his name to invoke the image of the great civil rights leader, fighting for what's good, but they use it to defend context which he would have stood against completely. For example, many of the people writing nowadays, they'll invoke how he spoke and said, writing is the voice of the unheard, which is true. But what they don't also tell you is that in the exact same speech is right after he went and said that if everyone in his movement took to rioting, took to violence to make their path known, he would have stood against them as a lone force, preaching as he always does that it is the wrong way to go down. And I thought that speech was good and was a good demonstration of his values and how biblical based that they are, that every human being is created in that image of God, irrespective of what they look like. He's also condemning blacks for their behavior, as well as whites, in that one speech, which was a knock at midnight. And this time around, I wanted to go talk about the other side of that coin. Because, I'm sure you've heard of the name Malcom X, probably not nearly as much as Martin Luther King, but it's certainly another name which comes up very commonly when you're talking about the civil rights era. And Malcolm X, he was almost the antithesis of Martin Luther King Jr., but many times nowadays they'll hold them in the exact same kind of esteem, exact same regard, though they preach completely different principles and we're definitely at odds with one another. So this time around, I wanted to make sure that I didn't just say things about this kind of person without really bringing you guys the same context. So these in the next two episodes will be about the values of these certain civil rights leaders. And I want to be illustrating these differences so you can understand that they're not all preaching the same thing. And I think what's an amazing thing about going about this is how you can see how, even though all these people I'll be bringing up will be black civil rights leaders, their ideas and their values are completely different. They don't all think the same way, and not all of what they did was good. So we'll start that all with the most famous of these, likely Malcolm X. And so we'll get into that soon. But first, I'm going to go over the usual kind of topics. What's going on in the news kind of today? Biden made his first State of the Union address. Depending on where you looked, the reviews of that were very, very, how would I put it? Mixed. But that's to be understood, because while both political sides have their own feelings towards the president. Other than that, what else came out? Falcon and Winter Soldier finished. Loki's been announced. Phase 4 of Marvel, they have their most recent trailer, and some of those movies look actually rather interesting. I'm curious what the Eternals is going to be like, and they're teasing that basically the end of Phase 4 is the Fantastic Four. And we'll have these movies, I'm assuming, ready for the next, what's it called? I think it went out to 2023, so the next 2 years. So it was the rest of the movies for this year, the rest of the movies for next year, and the rest of the movies for the year after that. So that's what Marvel has prepared for us. And I think everything had been delayed by a year. I'm curious what other changes we'll see along with that. And then in other news, actually this is an interesting story today. It was that one of the jurors of the Derek Chauvin trial case actually lied on the questionnaire, which they used to determine whether or not someone was fit to be a juror. And he had attended one of the BLM protests earlier that year, which was one of the things which would eliminate you from the process to be one of those jurors. Because the point of being on a jury is to have no knowledge of the events of the case whatsoever before coming in. That way, when the evidence is presented, your opinion will be only formed based on the evidence and not on what other people have said of said event, right? So that was interesting. That came out today. I wonder if it applies to any of the other jurors as well. Other than that, nothing really comes to mind of what's popped up in the news as startling or interesting, because, well, it's kind of been rather samey. Baseball's been going. So let's get into the question of the day then. What do you guys think of, how would I put this? Do you think racism has gotten better or worse over the last, I don't know, let's say 5 years in the United States? I think that's an interesting question because, well, in my perspective, so I'm like a 20-something Latino, growing up in Los Angeles, which is one of the Latino capitals of the United States, but it's full of everyone, whites, Asians, blacks, and anything else in between. And, well, despite what many people have said about growing up, I didn't really experience much of that, especially in my example where I was a Latino kid who was a captain of a team full of whites and Asians, and, well, we would joke around and stuff like that, but there was never anything actually kind of racist going on. And I've done other similar things, like one thing called Hobie, which brings students from every part of the United States all together, and not just the United States, but the rest of the world. And, I met people, white kids, Latino kids, black kids from Georgia, from Texas, from Oklahoma, from Tennessee, from Florida, from New York, from all these different places. I think the only state which didn't have a representative was from Wyoming. And, well, there was no racism whatsoever, if I remember correctly, on that trip. It was rather an awesome experience. So part of me feels like some of this is overblown, but I'm curious as to your thoughts. And the reason why I'm highlighting that specifically is the subject matter of Malcom X, because he is an interesting person. Malcom X was the polar opposite of Martin Luther King, whereas Martin Luther King preached a system of racial equality where all races can intermingle and coexist. And he also came at things from a Christian perspective, whereas Malcom X came at this from, Islamic perspective, because he was basically almost raised through the Nation of Islam, which is a group led by this man named Elijah Muhammad. It's a group which still exists today, and I believe it is Louis Farrakhan who is the current leader of the Nation of Islam. So let's start with a little bit background of Malcom X. So he was born in 1925, and he unlike Martin Luther King, who grew up within a strong family, Malcom X lived in a series of foster homes after his father's death and his mother's hospitalization. He started going to crime in his early 20s. And he was sent to prison for 10 years for theft and breaking and entering. And it was while he was in there that he joined the Nation of Islam and adopted the name Malcom X, and partly to not partly, the intention is to be rid of almost, what's the best way to describe this? I'm going to use this modern idea, almost decolonizing himself. Little, his original last name, he went by Malcolm Little, the name of his forefather. He believed that represented the vestige of this Western culture in his own life, and he wanted to be rid of that, remove that part. So when he put X, he put that to symbolize basically whatever he didn't know about whatever African culture that may have been a part of his past, his ancestral surname. That's what it meant to symbolize, because he wanted to represent whatever blackness is instead of what today would be called whiteness. So in the Nation of Islam, that's where it became kind of a lot more prominent, a lot more famous. He quickly rose to be one of the Nation of Islam's foremost speakers. The things that he preached were in regards to the civil rights movement were was stuff like black supremacy, and instead of racial segregation, he was preaching stuff such as complete segregation of black and white Americans to the point of almost black separation, almost like creating their own nation, kind of thing. He publicly criticized the mainstream civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King. He did not like the nonviolent and racial integrated basically angle that Martin Luther King aimed for, and he preferred basically either we do it by vote or we kind of force them out. And we'll go into all of that because I'll be reading parts of it's called his most famous speech, the Ballot or the Bullet. The reason why this is his most famous speech is because this is after his separation with the Nation of Islam. Him being a more bombastic type personality led to Elijah Muhammad and himself having more disagreements, and him having a public divorce from himself and the group known as the Nation of Islam. And well, the Nation of Islam doesn't take kindly to those kinds of separations. So soon after, once he was free from the rules that they had imparted on him, on the things he had to obey while talking about any of this stuff, he swiftly disobeyed and became much stricter on what he would actually say and advocate as his policies for the civil rights movement. And that came out with Ballot or the Bullet, which is the first speech after his separation from the Nation of Islam, and it's almost like his manifesto. It's the outline of his principles in the clearest form. And what we'll do for the next segment, and maybe into the third segment, is we're going to go into, unlike the last time where I read the whole speech first and then broke it down as best as I could in the fourth segment with a little bit at the end, this time I'm going to be breaking the notable stuff down as I read it to you. And I was I'll read a section and we'll elaborate on that means and contrast it to Martin Luther King Jr. and keep moving forward. And also I'll at the end I'll cite the last thing today. I want to cite 5 demonstrations of the Black Panthers from this era, in the 60s, late 50s. To show you the differences between them and the groups fostered by Martin Luther King. The difference in tactics, and it's kind of so you guys can see it and almost compare it to the types of stuff that we are seeing today. The main difference is we don't have a Martin Luther King type figure anymore, at least not in the public mainstream. You would have to go to other areas to find some people who preach the same principles. But I guess a major difference is no one can replicate Martin Luther King's almost universal appeal. What's interesting is certain aspects of Martin Luther King's principles were preached today, he would be demonized, and with certain things that he may have said, and which he has said, the people who have written stuff like the 1619 Project would be calling him stuff like an Uncle Tom or a self-hating minority, which is rather sad in the rhetoric nowadays. But I think it's important that we understand these kind of principles and illustrate those differences so we can make up our own minds about what is the right type of thing to follow. All right, so I'll see you all in the next segment. We're going to go through Malcom X's The Ballot or the Bullet. And yeah, well, I'll see you guys soon.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello and welcome back to the Life and Happiness podcast run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano, and let's get back into this one. So, this time around, we're going to be talking about the Ballot or the Bullet, which is Malcom X's most famous speech. We already went to the background of Malcom X. He was the rival to Martin Luther King and kind of the ostensible opposite of his kind of claims. And we'll see into these kind of values and the differences as we get into it. This speech was given at the King Solomon Baptist Church in Detroit, Michigan, April 12, 1964. So, let's start off. Mr. Moderator, Reverend Cleage, brothers and sisters and friends, and I see some enemies. In fact, I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we had an audience this large and didn't realize there were some enemies present. This is an interesting kind of change. So notice that Martin Luther King didn't regard, certain groups as enemies necessarily. He misguided folk, opponents, but never enemies. Anyways, let's continue. So, this afternoon, we want to talk about the ballot or the bullet. The ballot or the bullet explains itself. But before we get into it, since this is the year of the ballot or the bullet, I would like to clarify some things that refer to me personally concerning my own personal position. I'm still a Muslim. That is, my religion is Islam. My religion is still Islam. I still credit Mr. Muhammad for what I know and what I am. He's the one who opened my eyes. At present, I am the minister of the newly founded Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which has its offices in the Theresa Hotel, right in the heart of Harlem. That's the Black Belt in New York City. And when we realize that Adam Clayton Powell is a Christian minister, he has Ebenezer Baptist Church. But at the same time, he's more famous for his political struggling. And Dr. King is a Christian minister from Atlanta, Georgia, or in Atlanta, Georgia. But he's become more famous for being involved in the civil rights struggle. There's another New York Rev, Glamison. I don't know if you've ever heard of him out here. He's a Christian minister from Brooklyn, but he has become famous for his fight against a segregated school system in Brooklyn. Reverend Cleage right here is a Christian minister. Here in Detroit, he's head of the Freedom Now party. All of these are Christian ministers. All of these are Christian ministers. But they don't come to us as Christian ministers. They come to us as fighters in some other category. I am a Muslim minister, the same as they are Christian ministers. I'm a Muslim minister, and I don't believe in fighting today on any one front, but on all fronts. In fact, I am a black nationalist freedom fighter. Islam is my religion, but I believe my religion is my personal business. It governs my personal life, my personal morals, and my religious philosophy is personal between me and the God in whom I believe, just as these religious philosophies of these others is between them and the God in whom they believe. And this is the best way. Were we to come out here discussing religion, we'd have too many differences from the outstart and we could never get together. Okay, so I want to stop here for a little second and go into a little bit differences of that. So immediately talking about the black nationalist part, black nationalist freedom fighter. So I guess from that, showing how the black identity is, just the skin color of black is very important to Malcom X. And I find it interesting how he separates his religion between personal business and, well, it's separated from, I guess, political business. The reason being that's completely different for, even though he's saying the same thing about Martin Luther King, that they act that way. What that's not true. You can see the religion in everything that Martin Luther King says. It's his influence, it's his guide. The things he's preaching are based on his religious principles. So I find it interesting here how he's saying, "Oh, I have my religious principles, but they only affect how I act personally, being personal to people. And then I have a different philosophy when I go and preach and go talk civil rights and all that." And I find that odd. It feels like almost like a workaround between those principles. Like, do those principles only apply when you're by yourself, or those principles what guide you throughout your life, including how you interact with others? Because that's the point of having a worldview, right? That's the things that you believe, that are stuff down at your core, and it's part of why you treat people the way you do. So that's an interesting separation. So let's continue. The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. The time when white people can come in our community and get us to vote for them so that they can be our political leaders and tell us what to do and what not to do is long gone. Okay, actually I want to stop there because that's actually rather interesting too. So he was saying it's more important to have people in our community who are black and vote for them, because I'm assuming that means that their inherent blackness means they know how to take care of a black community, and someone, because they're white, has no idea what at all would apply to the black community, I guess. But honestly, that's an interesting point, because he's basically saying that white people, by the dint of being white people, are so different than black people that how they should never have one of them. It's always wrong to elect one of them to be a leader. Basically, they're so different that what they would do would not apply at all to the black community. Which is interesting, because that's what essentially racists in the South would say about black people. That's basically saying, like, it's like it's twofold thing. One, you're so different from us. You're completely different from us, and I can tell that just from the color of your skin. And also, you're simple enough that I understand one of you, and I can understand all of you. All of you think the same way. All blacks are the same. It's like the same exact logic. It's racist logic. Because the opposite logic is Martin Luther King's logic, whereas we have these differences, but we have much more in common. And especially when we keep the common good in mind. And those were principles which stuck through Martin Luther King's kind of stuff altogether. So immediately, this is sounding to me like instead of white supremacy, it sounds like black supremacy a little bit. Anyway, let's keep going. By the same token, the time when that same white man, knowing that your eyes are too far open, can send another Negro in the community and get you and me to support him so that he can use him to lead us astray. those days are long gone too. Again, as an aside, that's the same kind of logic that we were just talking about. And now it's weird. Now it's not even that you have to be black. You have to be black and say exactly what I am assuming Malcom X is saying. Because this scenario is like, okay, what if you're a black man preaching Western ideas? This is typically what's just attributed as white ideas. But that just means if you're black and you're saying ideas that are different from these, then you're just leading us astray that we should support you either. So it's kind of like constraining freedom of thought, saying you don't just have to be black. You have to be black and saying these specific ideas. And if you were truly black, you would believe these ideas. And that's a really, really odd and more racy kind of... It just feels like a misguided opinion. So let's continue. The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that if you and I are going to live in a black community, and that's where we're going to live, because as soon as you move into one of theirs, soon as we move out of the black community into their community, it's mixed for a period of time, but they're gone and you're right there all by yourself again. Again, more ideas with unique black culture versus unique white culture. There's no such thing as a middle ground. There's no universal principles. You're either one or the other. Let's continue. We must understand the politics of our community, and we must know what politics is supposed to produce. We must know what part politics plays in our lives, and until we become politically mature, we will always be misled. We will always led astray or deceived or maneuvered into supporting someone politically who doesn't have the good of our community at heart. So the political philosophy of black nationalism only means that we will have to carry on a political program of re-education to open our people's eyes, make us become more politically conscious, politically mature, and then we will, whenever we are ready to cast our ballot, that ballot will be cast for the man of the community who has the good of the community at heart. So, this reminds me of stuff that's in the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. It's because what that whole part was saying is, like, if you really understand politics, if you're truly politically mature, then you will be enlightened. Then you'll know what's the right way. And we have to re-educate people to become enlightened the way we are. So they're kind of just assuming they're right without looking at any other side. They're saying, you either believe what we do and you're enlightened, or you don't and you're not enlightened. You're too politically immature. So it's kind of going against truth and freedom of thought here. But let's continue. The economic philosophy of black nationalism only means that we should own and operate and control the economy of our community. You would never have found you can't open up a black store in a white community. White man won't even patronize you. And he's not wrong. He's got sense enough to look out for himself. It's you who don't have enough sense to look out for yourself. The white man is too intelligent to let someone else come and gain control of the economy of his community. But you will let anybody come in and control the economy of your community, control the housing, control the education, control the jobs, control the businesses, under the pretext that you want to integrate. Nah, you're out of your mind. Okay, well, let's step back again. So you can see it right there. It's labeling all white as essentially the same thing. And you do realize that there are a variety of different types of whites. Like whenever white is used, you know what it describes? It describes the British, it describes the French, it describes the Spanish, it describes the Italians, it describes the Germans, it describes the Russians, it describes Eastern Europeans, it describes the Serbians, it describes the Middle Eastern peoples, it describes Jews, kind of. There's so many different cultures and different peoples all under the idea of white, and even American is sometimes labeled as that white too, even though it's not based on a race. And even early American founding, people didn't see themselves as white. They saw themselves as Scottish, as Irish, as German, as British, all these kinds of things. So here you can see how he's kind of removing all those cultural kind of sentiments and labeling them all as white, the same kind of way racist people do for black culture as well. Because in reality, there's the Cubans, there's Nigerians, there's all these different groups, and there's the African Americans as well, who have our own unique culture as compared to other parts of black places in the world. So it's kind of, I find it personally absurd to have that label and kind of try to reduce everyone of a specific skin color to thinking and feeling the exact same way, just because there's so many other differences that are there. Think language, think your parents, think the religion, think your poverty level, think all these kind of stuff. And if you're ugly, if you're strong, if you're smart, like there's so many different things that factor into it. I find it feels like an absurd notion that some people are being reduced to the same kind of point. And we've got 1 minute left, so we'll read one little bit part. And you and I are in a double trap, because not only do we lose by taking our money someplace else and spending it, when we try and spend it in our own community, we're trapped because we haven't had enough sense to set up stores, control the business of our community. The man who is controlling the stores in our community is a man who doesn't look like we do. He's a man who doesn't even live in the community. So you and I, even when we try to spend our money in the block where we live, in the area where we live, we're spending it with a man who, when the sun goes down, takes that basket full of money in another part of town. So we're trapped, double trapped, triple trapped. Any way we go, we find that we're trapped. And every kind of solution that someone comes up with is just another trap. But the political and economic philosophy of black nationalism, shows our people the importance of setting up these little stores and developing them, expanding into larger operations. Woolworth didn't start out big like they are today. They started out with a dime store and expanded until today they're all over the country and all over the world, and they getting some of everybody's money. So a little short rundown of this, and then we'll end this segment. I find it interesting, the double trap kind of part as well. If that person has a store in that area, not only is that money that he's spending providing these goods for these people, also the employees in this area, who I assume would be black as well, since it's a black community, they're getting money too. That money's coming into them from actually kind of having this business in this area too. So feels like a rough argument. And the double trapped kind of thing. It's interesting how supportive he is of kind of capitalistic operations. He wants motivating black people to kind of expand, be business people, be entrepreneurial, look for something better. Anyways, we'll continue this speech in the next segment, and I'll see you all soon.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the Life and Happiness podcast run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano, and let's get back into the subject matter. So, right now we're going through one of the most famous speeches by Malcom X, and I'm stopping in between and analyzing parts of it so you can see the differences between him and people like Martin Luther King Jr. to see why they were kind of polar opposites in this kind of setting. So, yeah, let's get right back into it. Now, this is what you and I, General Motors, the same way. It didn't start out like it is. It started out like a little rat race type operation, and it expanded and expanded and expanded until today it's where it is right now. And you and I have to make a start, and the best place to start is right in the community where we live. So our people not only have to be re-educated to the importance of supporting black businesses, but the black man himself has to be made aware of the importance of going into business. And once you and I go into business, we will own and operate at least the businesses in our community. What we will be doing is developing a situation wherein we'll actually be able to create employment for the people community. And once you create some employment in the community where you live, it will eliminate the necessity of you and me having to act ignorantly and disgracefully, boycotting, picketing some cracker someplace else, trying to beg him for a job. You know, part of me just agrees with this partially. Because one of the things which was happening in the South was segregation, as you know, Jim Crow. And that was essentially state power overriding the things which were supposed to be passed during the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, enforcing their will in the community over and eliminating the rights of many blacks in the South. And it would help them out more. Like one of the things that Jewish people did. Jewish people also were mistreated in many places when they first came in large numbers to the United States. Is Jewish people started creating their own businesses. They always supported themselves. There were Jewish ghettos, but then in the Jewish ghettos, you had Jewish doctors, Jewish lawyers, you had Jewish grocery stores. They supported one another. And I do agree with that message that, you know what, in that dire situation, that's what they should have been striving to do, to be and constantly improving themselves, learning, and be able to produce something of value for their own community and even for other people as well. So let's continue. Anytime you have to rely upon your enemy for a job, you're in bad shape. When you and he is your enemy, you wouldn't be in this country if some enemy hadn't kidnapped you and brought you here. On the other hand, some of you think you came here on the Mayflower. Okay, I stop here again. So, interesting thing. I'll go pull this up for the next episode of the Life and Happiness podcast because I forgot where I put it. But more blacks have come to the United States voluntarily than ever did in a slave ship. The New York Times actually published this back in the 1980s, and they did another one illustrating how many more had come voluntarily in the 2000s, and I got to find those two articles. So I don't know if it's necessarily true here in this specific time period in 1964 when this speech was given, but it's important context to understand now that more blacks have voluntarily chosen to come to the United States than ever were brought here on slave ships. Okay, let's continue. So as you can see, brothers and sisters today, this afternoon, it is not our intention to discuss religion. We're going to forget religion. If we bring up religion, we'll be in an argument. And the best way to keep from arguments and differences, as I said earlier, put your religion at home, in the closet, keep it between you and your God. Because if it hasn't done anything more for you than it has, you need to forget it anyway. Whether you are a Christian or Muslim or nationalist, we all have the same problem. They don't hang you because you're a Baptist. They hang you because you're black. They don't attack me because I'm Muslim. They attack me because I'm black. They all attacked us for the same reason. All of us catch hell from the same enemy. We're all in the same bag, the same boat. So, I'm a little stop there. More of the same, we're putting all whites in the same category in the exact same manner that they're saying that they're being put away in the same category. So, it's interesting. It's that there's no higher value. There's no being the better man here. We got to come up to the same tactics that they are. Okay, so let's get back into it. We suffer political oppression, economic exploitation, and social degradation, all of them from the same enemy. The government has failed us. You can't deny that. Anytime you're living in the 20th century, 1964, and you're walking around here singing, "We shall overcome," the government has failed you. This is part of what's wrong with you. You do too much singing. Today, it's time to stop singing and start swinging. You can't sing up on freedom because you can't swing up on some freedom. Cassius Clay can sing, but singing didn't help him become the heavyweight champion of the world. Swinging helped him. So this government has failed us. This government itself has failed us. And the white liberals posing as our friends have failed us. And once we see that all of these other sources to which we've turned have failed, we stop turning to them and turn to ourselves. We need a self-help program, a do-it-yourself philosophy, a do-it-right-now philosophy. It's an already too late philosophy. This is what you and I need to get with. And the only way we're going to solve our problem is with a self-help program. Before we can get a self-help program started, we have to have a self-help philosophy. Black nationalism is a self-help philosophy. What's so good about it? You can stay right in the church where you are and still take black nationalism as your philosophy. You can stay in any kind of civic organization that you belong to and still take black nationalism as your philosophy. You can be an atheist and still take black nationalism as your philosophy. This is a philosophy that eliminates the necessity for division and argument. Because if you're black and you should be thinking black, and if you're black and you're not thinking black at this late date, well, I'm sorry for you. Okay, I'm going to stop right here and show this kind of thing. So this last paragraph is exactly what I was talking about. The religious principles don't matter anymore. Whatever the hell it is doesn't matter anymore. What matters is you think with your race first. And that's exactly what the racists do. That's exactly what Nazi Germany did. They thought Aryan race above anyone else and explicitly hated Jews more than any other group. That's what happens when you see things from the lens of race. It's everything becomes me or them, and it's irrespective of people are doing good or wrong. There's this book written by this Jewish lawyer named Alan Dershowitz. He's a very famous lawyer, and he's worked on every impeachment trial in the last 20 years. 20? Like 25 years. Because he was part of Bill Clinton and the Trump impeachment trials. So in this book, he talks about justice and how much of the things we've excused as justice kind of thing. And one of the articles which I thought was very interesting. I'll pull up this book for the next episode as well. It's he brings up these cases of how black rage is used to get people off of violent acts of crime. So let's say black person kills white person. Just a hypothetical example. Lawyers have been very creative in using such arguments as black rage to essentially say that the killing was justified and he should not be charged with murder. And actually, it's become more common that the kind of thing does happen, that they just acquit the person, even though there's the evidence to convict the person of that kind of crime. So it's corrupting the sense of justice, because what the argument goes is, because this person is a black person, they have experienced every sort of racism possible and injustice at the hands of the society, and thus no longer have to follow the rules of that society. Thus, murder becomes justified. Thus, assault, theft, riot, arson becomes justified. And it's not the only example of this kind of thing. Black rage is just one of many in that book that he talks about. There was one where, this is actually a real example from the book, this wife cut off the genitals of her husband and tossed it out of a car. And she did this in his sleep. She got off with it because the argument the lawyer made was she experienced such a bad time through the marriage that it made sense. Like it was gonna happen. She was completely justified in taking that kind of behavior towards her husband. And she got off with no punishment. And the reason why that perverts justice is because what justice means is, what justice in the original sense is based on, that there is a higher form of good and evil. And that transcends everything. It transcends your political philosophy. It transcends your race. It transcends your gender. It transcends all your age, all that kind of stuff. You're held accountable for the actions that you take, especially when it's something you did that was wrong. And in this kind of thing, it says when you're looking at race as the highest ideal instead of justice and truth, then, well, it doesn't matter if black people or white people or brown people or whatever kind of people, so long as they're your group, so long as they're within your own racial group, then whatever they do is justified if it pushes forward whatever the racial group's cause is. And, well, that just means good and evil are meaningless. Anyway, let's get back into it. Once you change your philosophy, you change your thought pattern. And you change your attitude. Once you change your attitude, it changes your behavior pattern. And then you go into some kind of action. As long as you got a sit-down philosophy, you'll have a sit-down thought pattern. And as long as you have that old sit-down thought, you'll be in some kind of sit-down action. And they'll have you sitting in everywhere. It's not so good to refer to what you're going through as sit in. That right there castrates you. Right there, it brings you down. What goes with it? Think of the image of someone sitting. An old woman can sit. An old man can sit. A chump can sit. A coward can sit. Anything can sit. Well, you and I have been sitting long enough, and it's time for us today to start doing some standing and fighting back that up. When we look at other parts of Earth and upon which we live, find that black, brown, red, and yellow people in Africa and Asia are getting their independence. They're not getting it by singing, "We shall overcome." No, they're getting it through nationalism. It is nationalism that brought about the independence of the people in Asia. Every nation in Asia gained its independence through the philosophy of nationalism. Every nation on the African continent has gotten its independence, brought it about through the philosophy of nationalism. And it will take back nationalism and bring the freedom of 22 million African Americans here in this country, where we've been suffered colonialism for the past 400 years. America is just as much a colonial power as England ever was. America is just as much colonial power as France ever was. In fact, America is more so colonial power than they, because she is a hypocritical colonial power behind it. What is the 20th? What do you call second-class citizenship? Why, that's colonization. Second-class citizenship is nothing but 20th slavery. How are you going to tell me that you're a second-class citizen? They don't have second-class citizenship in any other government on this earth. They just have slaves and people who are free. Well, in this country is a hypocrite. They try and make you think you're free by calling you a second-class citizen. No, you're nothing but a 20th century slave. So, on that, he's not wrong. In part of that, he's not wrong. The South did, as soon as they could after the Civil War, cut back against all the great things which came about from the Civil War, which is the end to slavery, the end to the bloodiest war in Earth's history. It was fought to end the practice, and we were just the fourth nation in the world, all of them Western nations, by the way, to do it. What he doesn't mention right there is that slavery exists in all of those nations, all those Asian nations, all those African nations, the Middle Eastern nations too. I would suggest you all to look at I forget the name of the website, but there's a group which monitors all the slaves which still exist in the world right now in 2021, and I think it was 40 million slaves estimated to still exist. Majority of them being women, because child trafficking, all that kind of stuff, sexual trafficking, all that kind of stuff as well. And guess where they are? Nearly everywhere in the world except the United States, Canada, Australia, and the Western nations of Europe. Everywhere else, slaves are rampant. That is something that is not talked about there. And even still, comparing slavery to the conditions of the 20th century or even now, that's such a bad comparison. Yes, it's not to say that it's not wrong, the things that were happening. Back then in the 60s, there were, in many parts of the United States, systems of real systemic racism. But in other parts of the United States, that had been long gone for a long time. Like I mentioned, Massachusetts always had the right to vote for every single person. Blacks were always had to vote there. Misstatement. Women didn't have the right to vote. Yeah, blacks did have the right to vote in Massachusetts. The right to vote would come later for women. That was one error that I did make there. But yeah, so we'll continue this in the next segment. He's going to keep going with this kind of theme of America being an evil place, and we'll keep going through that, and so we'll finish up the speech in that next segment. All right, I'll see you guys soon.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Alright, welcome back to this final segment of the Life and Happiness podcast. And it's a lot to cover, let's get right back into it. So here's back to Malcom X's speech, the ballot or the bullet. Why does it look like this might be the year of the ballot or the bullet? Because Negroes have listened to the trickery and the lies and the false promises of the white man now for too long, and they're fed up. They become disenchanted. They become disillusioned. They become dissatisfied. And all of this has built up frustrations in the black community that makes the black community throughout America today more explosive than all the atomic bombs the Russians can ever invent. Whatever you've got a racial powder keg sitting in your lap, you're in more trouble than if you had an atomic powder keg sitting in your lap. Whenever racial powder keg goes off, it doesn't care who it knocks out of the way. Understand this, it's dangerous. And in 1964, this seems to be the year. Because what can the white man use now to fool us? After he put down that march on Washington, and you see all through that now, he tricked you, had you marching down to Washington, had you marching back and forth between the feet of a dead man named Lincoln and another dead man named George Washington, singing, "We shall overcome." He made a chump out of you. He made a fool out of you. He made you think you were going somewhere, and yet going nowhere but between Lincoln and Washington. So today our people are disillusioned. They become disenchanted. They become dissatisfied. And in their frustrations, they want action. And in 1964, you'll see this young black man, this new generation, asking for the ballot or the bullet. That old Uncle Tom action is outdated. The young generation don't want to hear anything about the odds are against us. What do we care about the odds? When this country here was first being founded, there were 13 colonies. The whites were colonized. They were fed up with this taxation without representation. So some of them stood up and said, liberty or death. I went to a white school over here in Mason, Michigan. The white man made the mistake of letting me read his history books. He made the mistake of teaching me that Patrick Henry was a patriot and George Washington wasn't nothing violent about old Pat or George Washington. Liberty is death is what brought the freedom of whites in this country from the English. They didn't care about the odds, why they faced the wrath of the entire British Empire. And in those days, you say that the British Empire was so vast and so powerful that the sun would never set on it. This is how big it was. Yet these 13 little scrawny states, tired of taxation without representation, tired of being exploited, oppressed, and degraded, told that big British Empire, liberty or death. And here you have 22 million Afro-Americans, black people today, catching more hell than Patrick Henry ever saw. And I'm here to tell you that in case you don't know it, that you got a new generation of black people in this country who don't care anything whatsoever about the odds. They don't want to hear you, old Uncle Tom, hand handkerchiefs, heads talking about the odds. No, this is a new generation. If they're going to draft these young black men and send them over to Korea or to South Vietnam to face 800 million Chinese, if you're not afraid of those odds, you shouldn't be afraid of these odds. Why is America, why does this loom to be such an explosive political year? Because this is the year of politics. This is the year when all the white politicians are going to come into the Negro community. You'll never see them until election time. You can't find them until election time. They're going to come in with false promises, and they'll make these false promises. They're going to feed our frustrations, and this will only serve to make matters worse. I'm no politician, I'm not even a student of politics, not a Republican, nor a Democrat, nor an American, and got enough sense to know it. I'm one of 22 million black victims of the Democrats, one of 22 million black victims of Republicans, and one of 22 million black victims of Americanism. And when I speak, I don't speak as a Democrat or Republican, nor an American. I speak as a victim of America's so-called democracy. You and I have never seen democracy. All we have seen is hypocrisy. So, I do want to step out and talk a little bit about that. The interesting thing about it is talking about the evils of the United States, which of course, they've happened. They're real, and many have suffered. But the difference is the nuance which is not seen. It's not like it's ever been better anywhere else. It's been worse in most other places. Many of you may not know this, but a big reason for the African slave trade back in the Mediterranean was black chieftains in all these different groups in Africa were warring with each other and enslaving their black brethren in exchange for European gold and European weaponry. The Dutch were actually the biggest European nation involved in the slave trade. The United States was the one that used the slave trade the least. The United States was also the first ever nation to pass these anti-slavery measures, the first nation to ban the slave trade outright, and also, if you look at as I've shown you guys before with early American Revolution stuff, even at the moment when they were signing the Declaration of Independence, when they were making the Constitution, the topic of slavery as a mass evil was well within the American kind of mind at the time. And if it wasn't for the invention of cotton gin, in all likelihood, slavery may have ended within the first 20 years of the United States history. But it didn't, sadly. Slavery became much more profitable after the invention of cotton gin, and it stayed way longer than it should have. The evil sickness of racism was able to grow in some parts of the country, whereas in others, the spirit of liberty and racial equality and universal human rights given by a divine creator spread in those areas as well. That's why the North had a completely different culture. That's why the abolition movement, the end to slavery, came out of white Christians pointing out how wrong it is to treat some of God's children in that way, to belittle them, to strip them of their freedom. And that's what makes this place unique. It's the first place to stop it. You know what? We weren't perfect, and we know it's not perfect. But the point is, these ideals, that's what make people like Martin Luther King stand up for them. People like Frederick Douglass, like Booker T. Washington, like James Lafayette, like Harry Hoosier, and countless others. I could go on and on and on. But this lens, I'm sure you can see it's Malcom X's rhetoric is just as vile and racist as you would see it from. Imagine the exact same speech so far that we put in, but every instance of black we switched with white. That's the same type of speech that you would expect out of someone from the KKK, or switch it with every instance of black, put German, and then every instance of white, put Jewish. That you would sound very similar to the type of the things that Hitler would say. Racism, no matter what form it is a vile sickness, and it's all over this speech, sadly. But that goes with this kind of logic, this kind of, whenever you put race as the highest ideal, you forget the things which bind us together, the things which makes us human. You forget that there is such a thing as good and evil. So anyway, let's continue. When we open our eyes today and look around America, we see America not through the eyes of someone who has enjoyed the fruits of Americanism. We see America through the eyes of someone who has been the victim of Americanism. We don't see any American dream. We experience only the American nightmare. We haven't benefited from America's democracy. We've only suffered from America's hypocrisy. And this generation who's coming out now to see it are not afraid to say it. If you go to jail, so what? If you were black, you were born in jail. So I actually do want to step out from here. There's another interesting thing. You should check out Thomas Sowell talking about this. But him talking about blacks never having seen the American dream, well, if you look at the data from how blacks were doing economically after slavery, at the end of slavery, the vast majority of the black population was illiterate and unskilled. The only thing they could do was farm labor. But thanks to the efforts of men such as Booker T. Washington, blacks every generation were doing better and better, and the gap between them and whites was shrinking and shrinking. In fact, that trend continued all the way up to the 60s. It's only in the 60s when you bring in much of the reforms which were brought in, in the Great Society program, that the trend slowed and stagnated. If you're talking about the legacy of slavery, well, right after slavery, things were getting better and better for black people. It's not saying that they weren't in great situations. It's saying that every generation was doing better than the last. And that stopped really at that. In this junction, this whole kind of era we're talking about in the 60s. And so that's as a result of completely different circumstances than, this kind of black community. And, it's like, I guess it's almost an assumption that, everyone should experience the exact same kind of, situation, that everyone should end at the same place. But I guess, because my position on material equality, it's not the end-all be-all. Just because you'll have the same material status as the same one other person doesn't mean you'll be in the same good position of life. You can have worse situations with your family. You could have bad situations with your kids, whatever it may be. You may be single and alone. That there are things more important than the material status that we're in. And one thing that I look at when I read these stories of these old kind of black heroes in American culture, it's not that they felt that this place was perfect, because no, especially read Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is awesome, and when he was talking about all this stuff, so I'll give a little bit of background of him. He was a slave born in, I think it was Virginia, and he was able to he escaped slavery and into the North, and he was told all growing up that the Constitution said nothing about how to end slavery, that it was just a evil document to keep slavery in. But he himself looked to and read those founding documents, and he found that they were the most anti-slavery promise ever in anything he'd ever read. And along with the Bible, both of those things inspired him so, looking at them with an honest kind of perspective and trying to see what they were trying to say. I might go into this one for the next podcast. I'll talk about the 3/5 clause, how that was an anti-slavery measure. But to men like Frederick Douglass and to Martin Luther King Jr., these principles, the ideas themselves are good principles. They're what we could aim for. It's only the execution which has fallen poorly. We're not perfect, and the thing is, we need to move closer to that perfection, because that dream, that beautiful dream of liberty, which is contained within those documents, is amazing for everyone. We just have to make it into reality. We have to keep getting closer to that more perfect union, and that comes with striving for those ideals, embodying them in every single person. Just because some people who have the name American, who have fought for the flag, just because some of them are bad people, doesn't mean that all of them or the ideals are bad people. You have to prove the principles are bad to begin with. It's just like saying, does one person define the entire movement? And like one person making a mistake. And of course that's not true, because no one is perfect. There is not a single group which has ever existed which has a blameless record. Everyone makes mistakes. Every group, they have their flaws, they have their shortcomings. And you have to look at the good with the bad and judge honestly whether one thing was more good or more bad. Alright, so let's finish up as much as we can. If black you were born in jail in the North as well as the South, stop talking about the South. As long as you south of the Canadian border, you south. Don't call Governor Wallace a Dixie governor. Romney is a Dixie governor. 22 million black victims of Americanism are waking up, and they're gaining a new political consciousness, becoming politically mature. And as they develop this political maturity, they're able to see the recent trends in these political elections. They see that whites are so evenly divided that every time they vote, the race is so close that they have to go back and count the votes all over again. Which means that any bloc, any minority that has a block of votes that stick together is in a strategic position. Either way you go, that's who gets it. You're in a position to determine who goes to the White House and who'll stay in the doghouse. You're the one who has the power. You can keep Johnson in Washington, D.C., or you can send him back to his Texas cotton patch. You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the President Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. These whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you see this, you can see that Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a better position to be a determining factor, what do you get out of it? The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years, and all other legislation they wanted to bring up, they've brought it up and gotten it out of the way. Now they bring up you, and now they bring you up you. You put them first, and they put you last because you're a chump, a political chump. So I find it interesting that he talks about that at the end here. This will be the last part of the speech that we'll talk about. So I find it interesting. He sees that, he's been defining whites as a whole kind of essentially the same group the entire time. But then he's showing here that they're, at least ideologically, they're divided. They can't agree to the same things, that there's differences of opinions among whites. Yet he wants blacks to act all as the same exact block. They should have the exact same mindset. And like he said earlier in the speech, that if you don't agree with them, then you're against them, that you're essentially the same as the whites. So it's really interesting how it's like they want to be united about race, so only if you agree to these exact same ideas. It's very almost authoritarian in my kind of view. But yeah, this was Malcolm X. I wonder what your all thoughts on his speech were, and whether my analysis of the things he said were spot on, or if it was a little bit too judgmental. I would love to hear what your thoughts are. But yeah, this has been the Life and Happiness podcast. If you've liked this episode, give us a like and subscribe on YouTube. Give us a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Spreaker. And give us a share. We'll get these words around, these ideas around to more and more people. That way we can actually have these discussions that people can think and make for their own mind what they believe. So yeah, that was everything. I hope you all have a good one. This is Steven, signing off.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Life and Happiness Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find the show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows. From the GSMC Podcast Network, from sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Life and Happiness Podcast.